I didn't argue. I didn't send a long text. I just opened my laptop and checked 3 files I hadn't touched in years. Then I booked 3 appointments, 1 legal, 1 financial, 1 to transfer ownership. By dinner, my family was still talking about blood, not realizing the ground under them had already moved. But let me rewind. My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm 62 years old, and I live in Santa Rosa Bay, a quiet coastal town where life moves slowly. Enough that you start noticing patterns. And for 14 years, I lived inside one pattern that felt normal until it wasn't. I married Margaret when Lena had just finished high school. She was 18, standing at that line between being a child and being an adult. Her biological father had passed years before I came into her life. I never tried to replace him. I never used the word dad. I never asked for a title. I just showed up when help was needed. That was always my place. Close enough to support, far enough to not interfere with memories that weren't mine. When Lena went to college, I paid the tuition. When she said the dorms were too crowded, I helped with an apartment. When she needed a car, I helped choose one that wouldn't fail her. Nothing fancy, reliable. When her first business failed, she didn't call her mother. She called me, late, embarrassed. I listened. Then I paid the debts and helped her close it properly so it wouldn't follow her into the future. No lectures, no judgment, just cleanup. That was our rhythm. There were moves, breakups, hospital visits at strange hours, calls that started with silence because she didn't know what to say yet. I never asked for explanations. I never reminded her of what I'd already done. I treated each moment as its own responsibility. Margaret used to say I spoiled Lena. Maybe I did. But I also knew this was the only way I knew how to love someone who wasn't mine by blood. You don't claim space. You earn trust by being consistent. So, I became consistent. Tuition, rent, repairs, flights, groceries when money was tight, insurance when deadlines were missed. My love showed up as paperwork and quiet decisions. And paperwork becomes invisible over time. People notice gifts. They notice big gestures. They rarely notice stability. Stability becomes the floor they walk on without thinking. I never said, "Look what I've done." I never framed my help as sacrifice. I framed it as responsibility. And responsibility, when repeated long enough, stops looking like a choice. It starts looking like duty. And duty, over time, becomes expectation. I didn't see that shift happening, or maybe I chose not to. As long as things worked, I didn't question my role. I wasn't asking to be centered. I just didn't want to be erased. But when you stay behind the scenes too long, people forget you're there by choice. They assume you exist there by design. Lena grew into a confident adult. That made me proud. But confidence has a shadow. If no one teaches you to recognize support, you start believing support is part of the environment, like electricity, like air. It's not something you thank. It's something you assume. Margaret never corrected that, not because she was cruel, but because silence was her way of keeping peace. Challenging her daughter felt like creating conflict. So my role stayed undefined, convenient, unspoken. I handled what was complicated, but my presence wasn't something that needed to be acknowledged. And I allowed that, because stability mattered more to me than recognition. Looking back, I can see how consistency teaches the wrong lesson when it has no boundaries. When someone never withdraws, people forget withdrawal is possible. When someone never sets limits, others stop believing limits exist. Lena didn't suddenly decide I was obligated to her. She was trained into that belief by 14 years of yes. By 14 years of reliability that never changed shape. And I helped build that. Not out of weakness, out of loyalty. That's the quiet danger of being dependable. It builds trust, but it can also build entitlement if no one explains the difference between kindness and obligation. I never said, "I'm here because I choose to be." I acted as if I was here because it was my role. And roles, when repeated long enough, become identities in other people's minds. I became the one who handles it, not the one who chooses to help. There's a difference. One deserves appreciation. The other demands compliance. Because love without visibility becomes utility. And utility without recognition becomes something people think they own. That isn't cruelty, it's psychology. When someone shows up every time, people stop asking if they will. They start assuming they must. The shift from gratitude to expectation is slow, almost invisible. There's no argument, no dramatic moment, just a quiet rewrite of your position. I wasn't angry that I helped. I was unsettled when I realized my help had stopped being seen as a choice. 14 years of standing behind people can feel noble, but if no one ever turns around, it also means they've forgotten you were choosing to stand there. And when choice disappears, respect often follows. I didn't know it yet, but everything that came after started here, in the comfort of being useful, in the silence of being steady, in the mistaken belief that consistency automatically earns respect. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it teaches what they take for granted. 2 months after Lena got engaged to Ethan Miller, she drove down to Santa Rosa Bay with a ring on her finger and a folder on her lap. She was smiling the way people do when their life finally looks the way they planned it. Ethan stayed in the car, talking on the phone. "Business call," he said. Lena came inside alone. She told me they wanted to get married in California, a resort by the water, white sand, private pier, sunset ceremony. She said it like she was reading from a brochure. I nodded. Then she slid the folder across the table. Inside were photos of the place, a schedule, a draft guest list, and a separate page titled Family Signing Session. I asked what that was. She said it was just paperwork, something simple, to formalize things for the future. I didn't press. That night, Margaret brought it up again over dinner. She said the resort was expensive. Deposits, catering, security, logistics, more than Lena and Ethan could manage on their own. She said Ethan's family was struggling. Medical bills, a small business that never really recovered after the pandemic. She said it carefully, like she was delivering bad news without wanting it to sound like pressure. Then she said my name. She asked if I could help with the costs. Not all of it, just most of it. And she asked if I could also sign as the financial guarantor for the resort, in case something went wrong, in case payments were late, in case plans changed. She said it was temporary, just to make things smooth. I didn't answer right away. I finished my coffee, put the cup in the sink, came back to the table. I asked how much. She gave me a number. It wasn't small. I nodded again, not because I wanted to impress anyone, not because I thought they owed me anything, but because that was the role I had lived in for 14 years. When something heavy needed to be lifted, I was already standing there. Margaret reached for my hand. She said I was the only one who could do this. She said Lena trusted me. She said family helps family. I didn't correct her. The next day, I wired the first deposit. No announcement, no ceremony, just a confirmation email from the resort and a receipt in my inbox. Lena texted a heart emoji. That was it. A week later, Ethan came over for dinner. He was polite, careful with his words, thanked me for supporting the vision. He talked about branding, about how the wedding would also be a soft launch for their future. That was the first time I heard about the company. A small travel brand. Boutique experiences along the coast. Private tours. Luxury on a modest scale. Lena said I already owned part of it. I told her I didn't remember that. She said my name was on the legal registration. I checked later. It was true. Not because I asked for it. Because they needed my credit history to secure the initial loan. My name was on the documents. My signature was on the responsibility. But my seat was nowhere on the website. No photo, no title. Just a line in the filings. They called it administrative. They called it temporary. They called it just paperwork. A few days later, Margaret told me about the meeting, the family signing.
She said it would be held at the resort a week before the wedding, to finalize the company structure, to align expectations. She said Uncle Harold would join by video call. He had opinions about these things. She said Lena wanted it to feel official, like a new chapter. I asked who would be there. She named them: Lena, Ethan, Margaret, Uncle Harold, 2 lawyers from Ethan's side, an accountant. I waited. She didn't say my name. I asked if I was needed. She hesitated. She said I would help with the documents anyway, but the meeting itself was mostly for blood relatives. She said it gently, like she was moving a fragile object from one shelf to another. I nodded again. That night, I sat at my desk and looked at the confirmation emails from the resort. The amounts, the dates, my name in the billing information. The next morning, I forwarded the guarantor forms back to the resort. Signed, no note, no conditions. A week passed, then another. Plans moved forward. Lena talked about flowers, about seating, about a live band. She never mentioned the signing session again. Margaret avoided the topic. When I asked about the agenda, she said it was still being drafted. She said it wasn't important. She said the wedding was what mattered. But small things started to change. Documents were sent to my email without context. Requests for approval, not discussion. Questions about numbers, not opinions. I answered them. I didn't comment. Then one afternoon, Lena called. She said they were finalizing the seating plan. She said the ceremony would be intimate, immediate family only. She said the signing session would be right after. Private room, closed doors. She said it like it was a logistical detail, not a boundary. I said I understood. She paused. Then she said she was glad I was being reasonable. After the call, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I didn't sit down. I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood there. There was a chair at that table with my name on the documents, and none with my name on the invitation list. The resort was real. The signing session was real. The company was real. My responsibility was real. But my place in the room wasn't. I hadn't been pushed out, not loudly, not dramatically. Just quietly removed from the part where people decide who belongs. At the time, I didn't call it betrayal. I called it confusion. I told myself it was stress, planning, money. Weddings make people strange. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself I had always been in the background, so why would this be different? But something had shifted. Not in the tone, in the structure. The story was no longer about a wedding. It was about ownership, about authority, about who signs and who just pays. And for the first time, I realized the seat that was missing wasn't at the ceremony. It was at the table where family becomes legal. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, not at our house, not at the resort, but at a small conference room in Santa Rosa Bay that Lena said was neutral ground. She said it would be easier for everyone. Margaret and I arrived early. We sat across from each other. She kept checking her phone. I watched the window. At exactly 3 o'clock, Lena joined the call. Ethan was beside her, slightly off camera. Uncle Harold appeared a few seconds later, his face filling the screen before he adjusted the angle. He didn't ask how anyone was doing. He went straight to business. He said this was a family matter. He said weddings were emotional, but ownership was serious. He said bloodlines mattered when decisions affected the future. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said, people outside the family should know their place in these conversations. No one interrupted him. Lena smiled, small and polite. Not nervous, not defensive, just agreeable. I waited for her to correct him. She didn't. Margaret shifted in her chair. She looked at her hands. Ethan cleared his throat like he wanted to say something. Then he didn't. Uncle Harold continued. He talked about legacy. He talked about keeping control within the blood. He talked about how money can blur roles if people aren't careful. When he said people, he meant me. I understood that clearly. For the first time, I heard the word outsider without emotion attached to it. It wasn't an insult. It was a classification, a position, a line on a chart. Lena finally spoke. She said she appreciated everything I'd done. She said I was important. She said I had always supported her. Then she said something that changed the air in the room. She said, for the legal side, it would be simpler if Daniel handled the paperwork and financing. But for the family session, it should just be blood. She said it calmly, like she was explaining seating arrangements. I asked one question. Do you mean I handle responsibility, but not presence? She hesitated. Then she nodded. She said, it's not personal, it's just structure. Margaret didn't look at me. Ethan looked at the table. Uncle Harold smiled, satisfied. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about a wedding. It wasn't even about money. It was about control. They wanted my function, not my voice. They wanted my signature, not my seat. And what surprised me wasn't the request. It was how natural it felt to them. No one thought they were being unfair. No one thought they were taking something. They thought they were organizing. That's when I saw what 14 years of giving had quietly built. When someone gives too much for too long, without boundaries, people stop seeing it as generosity. They start seeing it as normal. Not, he's helping, but this is how things work. In behavioral psychology, they call it entitlement, not arrogance, not cruelty, just expectation. When help becomes predictable, it stops being kindness. It becomes obligation. I had paid tuition, so education felt covered. I had handled emergencies, so safety felt guaranteed. I had carried financial risk, so risk stopped feeling risky. They weren't ungrateful. They were trained by consistency, by silence, by my willingness to never make my support conditional. Over time, my role shifted from supporter to provider, from provider to system. And systems don't get thanked. They get used. When Lena said, "You can handle the financial side," she wasn't asking. She was assigning. When she said, "But not the family part," she wasn't excluding. She was defining hierarchy. Blood speaks. Others serve. Margaret finally spoke. She said, "Let's not make this bigger than it is." She said, "We all know Daniel's heart." She said, "This is just logistics." But logistics shape dignity. Logistics decide who sits where, who signs where,
Who gets consulted, who gets informed, and who just gets told. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I asked one more question. So when decisions change, am I informed, or do I just adjust? Lena looked uncomfortable. She said, "We'd let you know if it affected you." That answer told me everything. I was part of the machine, not part of the direction. Uncle Harold leaned forward on the screen. He said, "This is how families protect themselves." I looked at him and thought how easy it is to protect something you never pay for. He spoke about blood, but he never spoke about risk, never spoke about debt, never spoke about guarantees. He carried authority without carrying consequence. That's the quietest imbalance of all. Power without responsibility. I nodded, not in agreement, in clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system where my kindness had become infrastructure. And infrastructure isn't consulted. It's assumed. I realized something else in that moment. They didn't think I would ever stop, because I never had. People don't test boundaries that have never existed. They don't prepare for withdrawal from someone who is never withdrawn. So when Lena said, "You can help with finances," what she really meant was, "You will." Not because she was cruel, but because my help had become the standard. And standards don't need permission. They need compliance. Margaret finally looked at me. Her eyes were asking me not to complicate things, not to disrupt peace, not to threaten the image of harmony. But harmony built on silence is fragile. It depends on one person staying smaller than they are. I said, "I understand." And I meant it. I understood that this wasn't about gratitude. This was about ownership, not of property, but of narrative. Who is family? Who is support? Who belongs? And who exists to maintain comfort? The meeting ended politely. No raised voices, no accusations. Just structure being clarified. After the call, the room felt larger, not empty, just honest. I had been reduced to a function, and functions don't have dignity. They have utility. That was when I knew. They didn't just want me out of a ceremony. They wanted me out of respect. Because respect requires equality. And equality threatens systems built on quiet dependence. Kindness, without boundaries, had turned into expectation. Expectation had turned into entitlement. And entitlement had turned into authority. Not earned, assumed. That was the moment the story stopped being emotional and started being legal. I didn't argue after that meeting. I didn't try to explain myself. I didn't defend my position. I asked one question. "So I carry the responsibility," I said, "but I don't have a place?" The room went quiet, not uncomfortable, just still. Lena looked at me and said, "If you want to help, that's your choice. If not, we'll figure something else out." She said it calmly, not as a threat. not as an apology, as a trade. Help without recognition, or step aside without complaint. Margaret spoke quickly after that. She said Lena was stressed. She said weddings made people emotional. She said we shouldn't take things too literally. But she never said Lena was wrong. That mattered. I stood up, not dramatically, just the way someone stands when a conversation is finished. I went to the kitchen, washed a glass that was already clean, put it back in the cabinet. That night, I didn't replay the conversation. I didn't imagine better answers. I didn't plan speeches. I opened my laptop. When you reach a certain age, you stop proving things with words. You start checking facts. I searched my name in our shared records, not emotionally, administratively. And what I found wasn't anger. It was clarity. My name was on the guarantor forms for the resort. My signature was on the business registration. My credit backed the loans. My accounts secured the deposits. But my role had never been written down. No title, no authority, no protection. Only obligation. That's when I understood something most people miss. Power isn't in the voice that speaks the loudest. It's in the documents that don't need to speak at all. People think power looks like dominance, raised voices, control in conversation, emotional pressure. But real power is quieter. It sits in contracts, in clauses, in ownership percentages, in liability. One signature can carry more weight than 100 arguments. I didn't need to convince anyone of my value. My value was already documented. They just didn't expect me to read it. The next morning I called Linda Parker. She'd handled several of my property transactions over the years. Sharp, direct, not interested in drama. I told her I needed a full review of my exposure, everything my name was attached to. She didn't ask why. She asked when. That afternoon I met with Mark Collins, my financial advisor. We sat across from each other in his office. He opened his laptop. I handed him a list of accounts. He scrolled quietly. Then he looked up and said, "You're carrying most of the risk here. Not a judgment, a fact." He said, "If anything collapses, you absorb the damage." I nodded. That part wasn't new. What was new was how little protection I had in return. No voting rights, no equity structure in my favor, no clause acknowledging contribution. I wasn't a partner. I was a buffer between their plans and reality, between their confidence and consequence. That's when the idea of fairness stopped being emotional and started being mathematical. Every system is honest on paper. People lie. Documents don't. That's why institutions trust files more than intentions. And that's why real authority doesn't need to raise its voice. It just opens a folder. Linda explained my options. Not what I should do. What I could do. There's a difference. I could withdraw guarantees. I could separate accounts. I could remove my name from legal representation. I could formalize the lack of obligation. Not aggressively, legally. Mark showed me timelines, impacts, exposure. If I stepped back, nothing would collapse instantly, but the system would feel it. Slowly, quietly, in deadlines, in approvals, in access. I didn't feel powerful. I felt responsible. Because power without responsibility is cruelty. But responsibility without power is servitude. And I had been living in the second one. People imagine power as something you take. In reality, power is something you stop giving away. I didn't want revenge. I wanted balance. I wanted the structure to reflect the truth.
that if I carried weight, I deserved position. And if I had no position, I shouldn't carry weight. It was that simple. That night, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make announcements.
I didn't send messages. I organized. Files, contracts, agreements, timelines. I created a digital folder, nothing dramatic, just accurate. Because accuracy is the strongest form of authority. People can argue emotions. They can dismiss intentions. They can reinterpret memory. But they can't negotiate with facts. This is what most people never learn. Power isn't how loudly you defend yourself. It's how clearly your name appears on the right documents. One email, one clause, one ownership percentage. Those things don't argue. They decide. I wasn't preparing to fight. I was preparing to step into a position I had already earned. Silently, legally, completely. When people talk about standing up for yourself, they imagine confrontation. I was doing something quieter. I was aligning my reality with my responsibility. And once that alignment exists, words become optional. Because when the structure changes, behavior follows. Not because people suddenly understand you, but because the system does. And systems always speak last. I didn't leave behind a binder. I didn't write a long letter. I didn't make a dramatic announcement. I prepared a USB drive. It was small, metal, heavy in the hand. Inside it, I put everything. Every transaction, every contract, every guarantee, every transfer of funds, every document with my signature. Not to accuse, not to threaten, just to record. Truth doesn't need emotion. It only needs order. I labeled the folders by year, then by category. Business, property, personal guarantees, bank movements. It wasn't difficult, because I had lived this system for years. I just had never looked at it from the outside. When you finally do, you notice something. They called it family money. They called it inheritance. They called it what her father left behind. But the numbers didn't agree. The purchase of the beach property? My funds. The renovation of the resort brand? My funds. The cash flow that kept the business stable? My accounts. The legal structures that protected it all? My name. What they called legacy was mostly leverage. Mine. And I had allowed it to wear someone else's story. Not because I was fooled, because I thought dignity was worth more than credit. I had signed things in ways that made others feel secure, respected, independent. I never corrected the narrative. I never needed the applause. But I also never imagined that same narrative would be used to erase me. That's what changed everything. Not the money. The logic. I added one more file to the USB, a simple spreadsheet. Where the capital came from, where it went, what it supported. No commentary, no conclusions. Just alignment. Then I printed a single-page note, not emotional, not confrontational. It said, "All financial ties connected to my name end today." The attached data explains what that means. I placed the note in an envelope, sealed it. No signature. They knew my handwriting. I left the USB and the envelope on the conference table, the same table where we had discussed family, the same table where my chair had become optional. I didn't wait for them to read it, because this wasn't a performance. It was a transition. That afternoon, I made the calls, to the bank, to the registrar, to the business office. I withdrew guarantees, separated accounts, removed my name as representative. No arguments, no objections, just process. When something is legal, it doesn't argue back. Uncle Harold called me later. He always spoke like authority came from tone. He asked what I was doing. He said I was being dramatic. He said family should handle things privately. I asked him one question. Are you listed on any of the loans? He didn't answer. I asked another. Are you liable if this collapses? Silence. That's when I understood his position. He wanted blood to define power, but he never carried consequence. It's easy to guard tradition when you don't fund it. I told him I wasn't breaking the family. I was clarifying it. He said I was overreacting. I said, then you won't be affected. He didn't like that, because fairness sounds different when it applies. I didn't go back to the house that night. I stayed at a small place near the bay, quiet, clean. The next morning, I got the first message. Not anger, confusion. Then the second, concern. Then the third, urgency, because systems respond faster than emotions. They noticed approvals pending, funds on hold, names missing. That's when power becomes visible. Not when you speak, when access changes. They opened the envelope that afternoon. I know because Margaret called. She didn't yell. She asked what the USB was. I told her it was everything they said wasn't mine. There was a pause. Then she said, "Why would you leave this?" I said, "Because you should know what you're standing on." She asked if I was angry. I said no, I was finished. Finished being the structure behind a story that excluded me. Finished being responsible without being recognized. Finished being present without being seen. That's not revenge. That's resignation from a role I never agreed to formally. Power doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrives like silence after truth is placed on a table. No one could accuse me of destroying anything. All I did was remove myself from a system that had already removed me. That's the part people misunderstand. I didn't take something away. I stopped providing what I had never been thanked for. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. When the narrative changed, so did the dependency. And when dependency disappears, respect has a chance to become real, or to vanish completely. Either way, it becomes honest. The USB wasn't a weapon, it was a mirror. It showed who built what, who carried what, who benefited, and who spoke about blood while standing on borrowed ground. I left it there because truth shouldn't be whispered. It should be available. And because once people see the structure, they can't pretend the power was always emotional. It was logistical. It always was. The first thing that changed was the tone of the calls. Before, they were casual, short, assumptive. Now, they were careful. The resort manager called and asked if the guarantee was still valid. The bank emailed about temporary review. The event coordinator asked if the deposits were secure. No one sounded angry. They sounded unsure. That's what happens when support disappears quietly. Margaret called me that evening, not to argue, to ask what was happening. She said things felt unstable. She said people were asking questions. She said she didn't understand why everything suddenly felt fragile. I told her nothing had changed, only visibility. The safety they felt had always come from my name. They just hadn't noticed it until it stopped working automatically. Lena called after that. Her voice was tight, controlled. She said the resort had reduced their space. The guest list had to be cut. The schedule had to be simplified. She said the wedding was being adjusted, not canceled. Adjusted. Ethan called the next morning, polite, careful. He said he didn't want to get involved in family tension. He said he respected my position. He asked if there was any way I could help smooth things out. That word again, help. I told him I had already helped for 14 years. He paused. Then he said he understood, but he didn't, not really. Because understanding means accepting consequence, and he was still asking me to remove it. Uncle Harold called that afternoon. He didn't ask how I was. He asked what I was trying to prove. He said I was embarrassing the family. He said I was making things public. He said blood mattered more than paperwork. I asked him if he had spoken to the bank. He said no. I asked if he had offered any financial backing. He said that wasn't his role. That was the moment the imbalance became impossible to ignore. He defined loyalty, but he never funded it. He shaped narrative, but he never carried risk. He wanted authority without accountability, and that's the easiest kind to claim. Lena called again 2 days later. This time, she cried, not loudly, just enough to be heard. She said everything had become complicated. She said people were stressed. She said she didn't want conflict. Then she said something different. She said I could come to the wedding. She said I could sit in the front row if I wanted. She said we could make things feel normal again. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I asked one question.
If nothing had changed financially, would you still be calling?
There was silence, not long, but real. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't meant what she said before. She said she had spoken out of stress. She said she didn't want to lose me. That's when something became clear. There are two kinds of apologies. One comes from remorse. The other comes from fear. Remorse says, I hurt you and I need to change. Fear says, I lost something and I need it back. They sound similar, but they move in opposite directions. Remorse accepts consequences. Fear negotiates them. I told her I wasn't upset about not being invited. She said she didn't understand. I said, you didn't uninvite me from a wedding. You removed me from respect. She said that wasn't what she meant. I said, then why did it only matter after things collapsed? Another pause. Then she asked if I would reconsider, if I would attend, if I would help restore things.
I told her something she hadn't expected. I don't want to be invited because you need something from me. I want to be respected even when I give nothing. She said she did respect me. I said, respect that only appears after loss isn't respect. It's adjustment. She started to say she was trying. I said I believed her. But trying to recover comfort is not the same as trying to repair harm. Margaret called after that conversation. She didn't defend Lena. She didn't accuse me. She said the house felt different, quieter, tenser. She asked if I was angry. I said no. I was finished negotiating my worth. She asked if I could meet and talk. I said we already had, for years. I had just been the only one listening. That night, I sat alone by the bay. The water was calm, the kind of calm that comes after movement. I thought about how often people confuse peace with stability. Stability is built. Peace is chosen. And sometimes peace comes from letting structures fall. Eaton sent a message the next day. He said he respected my boundaries. He said he hoped things could be repaired. That word again, repaired, as if this were damage. But damage assumes accident.
This wasn't an accident. It was a pattern that finally met consequence. Uncle Harold sent a long message about family, about tradition, about forgiveness. He didn't mention responsibility. He didn't mention contribution. He didn't mention equity. He wanted resolution without redistribution. That's not reconciliation. That's preservation. Lena sent one last message, short. She said, "I'm sorry if I made you feel unwanted." That sentence mattered. If. Apologies that contain if protect the speaker. They soften ownership. They create space to retreat. Real remorse doesn't need protection. It stands exposed. I didn't respond, not because I was punishing her, because I wasn't negotiating anymore. When people apologize only after benefit disappears, it's not conscience, it's alarm. It's the nervous system reacting to loss of stability, and that reaction is understandable. But it's not healing. It's survival. I wasn't looking for survival. I was looking for truth. I wasn't interested in being included again. I was interested in being recognized. There's a difference. Inclusion can be transactional. Recognition is structural. You don't invite someone back into dignity. You honor it whether they serve you or not. That's what had never happened. They didn't want me gone. They wanted me silent, useful, and invisible. Now that silence was broken, not by anger, by withdrawal, by consequence, by the end of automatic support, and that changed the story. Not because I demanded anything, but because the system no longer protected comfort without cost. When apologies come after loss, you have to ask one question. Would this exist if nothing had changed? If the answer is no, then it isn't remorse. It's response. And responses fade. Remorse stays. I didn't reject their apologies. I just refused to treat them as repair. Because repair starts with responsibility, not relief. And responsibility doesn't ask for its benefits back. It changes its behavior. That's the difference between regret and fear. One reshapes character. The other reshapes circumstance. And only one deserves trust. That night, I didn't think about what Lena said. I thought about what Margaret didn't say. I replayed the room in my head, the way Lena spoke, the way Ethan looked away, the way Harold positioned himself like a judge who never had to pay. And then there was Margaret. She sat there, hands folded, eyes lowered, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just present. For years, I believed her silence meant peace, that it meant balance, that it meant she was trying to keep the family from breaking. But silence isn't neutral. It never is. Silence always protects something. Sometimes it protects love.
Sometimes it protects comfort. Sometimes it protects fear. That day, it protected a structure that used me, and I didn't see it clearly until everything stopped moving. People talk about cruelty like it always comes loud. Raised voices, harsh words, clear rejection. But some of the deepest damage comes from quiet agreement. From watching something wrong happen and deciding not to interrupt it. From letting someone become smaller so that the room can stay calm. Margaret didn't push Lena to speak that way, but she didn't stop her either. And that mattered. Because in families, authority doesn't only belong to the one who speaks. It also belongs to the one who allows. She wanted to protect her daughter. I understood that. She wanted to keep harmony. I understood that too. But protection that costs another person their dignity is not protection. its redistribution of harm. She had been choosing Lena's comfort over my position for years. Not loudly, not aggressively, quietly, through omissions, through softened responses, through the decision to let me absorb pressure so that no one else had to feel it. That doesn't look like cruelty. It looks like kindness. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because kindness without boundaries becomes permission. And permission becomes expectation. And expectation becomes entitlement. I had allowed myself to become the stabilizer, the silent fixer, the one who absorbed chaos so that others could pretend it wasn't happening. I called it responsibility. But responsibility without reciprocity becomes erosion. It eats at your place without announcing itself. I realized something sitting alone that night. The moment that changed everything wasn't when Lena called me an outsider. It was when Margaret let that word sit in the air without challenge. Not because she agreed, but because she chose not to disrupt it. In that moment, silence became alignment, not with Lena's intention, but with the structure that reduced me. People think silence is gentle, that it keeps peace, that it avoids conflict. But silence is only gentle to the person it protects. To everyone else, it's confirmation. It says, this is acceptable. It says, this will not be corrected. It says, you can continue. That's when I understood something deeper. The person who breaks a family is not always the one who speaks harshly. Sometimes it's the one who witnesses harm and names it stability. Margaret wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to keep the image intact. A mother, a daughter, a wedding, a story that made sense. And I was the cost. Not intentionally, not maliciously, functionally. I had become the thing that made the story work, the background support, the invisible pillar, the part that could be removed without disrupting the narrative, until it was gone. When I withdrew my name, my accounts, my guarantees, I wasn't punishing anyone. I was removing myself from a role that required my erasure. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand apologies. I just stepped out of a structure that only functioned because I agreed to be invisible. That's not revenge. That's clarity. Margaret came to see me a week later, not to fight, not to plead. She asked if I really meant it, if I was truly stepping back from everything. I said yes. She asked why. I said, because silence became my job, and I never agreed to that. She looked confused. She said she never asked me to be silent. I said, you didn't have to. You accepted it. There was a long pause. She said she didn't know what else she could have done. I said, you could have said my name. She asked what I meant. I said, you could have said, he is part of this family. His role matters. She said she didn't want to upset Lena. I said, so you chose to erase me. That wasn't an accusation. It was a description. Her eyes filled, but she didn't argue. That was the first honest moment we had in years. She had been managing relationships. I had been carrying consequences. Those are not the same thing. She said she thought keeping peace was kindness. I said, peace that depends on someone being smaller isn't peace. It's imbalance. She asked if I was leaving the family. I said no. I was leaving dependency. I wasn't cutting connection. I was cutting function. I was no longer the financial anchor, the legal buffer, the invisible authority. I would be present only where I was respected without condition. That's not punishment. That's self-definition. She said she felt like she had failed both of us. I said, "You didn't fail. You chose. And now you're seeing the cost. That's different. Failure is accidental. Choice is directional." I didn't blame her, but I stopped absorbing her decisions. That's where dignity begins.
Silence, I learned, is not always kindness. Sometimes it is participation, not in action, in allowance. When someone speaks in a way that diminishes another, and the room stays quiet, the room becomes complicit. Not out of cruelty, out of comfort. And comfort is powerful. It convinces people that stability is more important than truth, that quiet is more important than justice, that harmony is more important than dignity. But harmony built on imbalance is temporary. It only lasts as long as one person agrees to carry more weight than they should. When I withdrew, the family didn't collapse. It reconfigured. And that told me everything I needed to know. If my presence had been valued, it would have been defended. Not remembered, not requested back. Defended. Silence had been easier for everyone, except me. I didn't need an apology from Margaret. I needed acknowledgement. That silence is not neutral. That choosing not to intervene is choosing a side. That protecting peace by sacrificing someone else's place is still harm. I wasn't angry. I was done accepting roles that required my disappearance. So I left quietly, not out of resentment, out of respect for myself. Because boundaries don't need noise. They need consistency. And silence, when used to protect injustice, is not kindness. It is consent. And I no longer consented. I live by the water now. Not in a big house, not in anything impressive. Just a small place that gets enough light in the morning and stays quiet at night. I wake up early. I make my coffee. I walk along the shore before most people are even awake. There's no urgency here. No one needs anything from me. That was strange at first. When you spend your life being the one people lean on, silence feels empty before it feels peaceful. I had to learn the difference. Twice a week, I volunteer at a local community center. I teach young adults how to manage money, not how to get rich, just how to stay steady, how to read a contract, how to understand debt, how to say no without apology. They don't know my story. They don't need to. All they need is someone who takes them seriously. After class, I walk, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer. There's a rhythm to it. Step, breath, step. It reminds me that I'm still here, that my worth isn't measured by how useful I am to someone else. A few months ago, I got a message from Ethan. Short, careful, polite. He said Lena had a baby, a boy. He said she was doing well. He said she asked about me. He said she wanted to talk, to reconnect, to heal things. I read it once, then I put my phone down. Not because I was angry. Not because I wanted to punish anyone. But because I knew what that conversation would become. An apology, a soft voice, a story about stress, about pressure, about misunderstandings. And somewhere inside it, the same question would appear again. Can you help? Maybe not with money, maybe not with contracts, but with stability, with reassurance, with being the one who makes everything feel safe again. I don't do that anymore. Not because I stopped caring, but because I finally learned to care about myself in the same way. Respect that only appears when someone needs you is not respect. It's strategy. I didn't respond. That was my answer. People think closure is loud, that it comes with speeches or confrontation.
Sometimes closure is just choosing not to step back into a role that cost you your dignity. I don't miss the noise. I don't miss being needed. I miss the version of myself who thought love meant endurance. But I don't want to be him again. This part of my life is quiet, and it is honest. No one praises me for what I give, because I'm not giving anything that costs me my place. No one depends on me to hold their world together, and that has made my own world stronger.
If you are someone who always gives, always supports, always fixes, this part is for you. Not as advice, not as instruction, just as a mirror. Ask yourself one question. If I stop giving, will I still be respected? Not missed, not requested, not needed. Respected. There is a difference. Being missed means you were useful. Being needed means you were functional. Being respected means you were seen. Most people confuse the first two for the third. I did too for a long time. I thought loyalty meant staying even when my role kept shrinking. I thought love meant tolerating imbalance. I thought maturity meant silence. But maturity is knowing when silence protects something that shouldn't be protected. You don't have to leave your family. You don't have to walk away from everyone. But you do have to notice when your value is measured only by what you provide. That is not connection. That is dependency, wearing a kind face. Your boundaries don't have to be dramatic. They don't need to be announced. They just need to be real. The first time you say no and nothing collapses, you will feel strange. The second time, you will feel clearer. By the third time, you will realize how much weight you were carrying that was never yours. People will adjust, or they won't. Either way, you will finally be standing in a place that belongs to you. I don't feel lonely here. I feel intact. There is a difference between being alone and being unburdened. One hurts, the other heals. When I teach those young people about money, I'm really teaching them about position, about knowing where they stand, about understanding what they sign, about recognizing when something costs more than it appears. I wish someone had taught me that earlier. Not about finances, about relationships, about the invisible contracts we accept when we give too much without being asked. I am not angry at my past. I understand him. He wanted to be good. He wanted to be solid. He wanted to be the man people could rely on. Those are honorable desires. But honor without balance becomes self-erasure. And self-erasure is not kindness. It's abandonment of the self. So if you're watching this, and you feel tired in a way that rest doesn't fix, if you feel appreciated only when you are solving a problem, if your absence creates panic, but your presence is taken for granted, you are not weak. You are overextended. There is a difference, and you are allowed to step back, not to punish, not to prove a point, but to breathe in a space where your worth is not negotiable. Self-respect is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand applause. It shows up in choices no one sees. In the call you don't return. In the obligation you decline. In the role you finally release. I didn't rebuild my life. I simplified it. And in that simplicity, I found something I had been missing for years. Peace that doesn't depend on my usefulness. If you stop giving and respect disappears, it was never respect. It was access. And access is not love. You don't owe your disappearance to keep someone else comfortable. You don't owe your exhaustion to prove your loyalty. You owe yourself a place where your presence is not conditional. That is not selfish. That is sane. I walk by the ocean every morning now. The water doesn't ask me for anything. It just exists. And somehow, that reminds me that I'm allowed to do the same.